The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
We have a special Volpe report this week, not only because we have two premier journalists, but also because of the issues we face in Washington and Harrisburg, which require that we devote two shows to cover the issues. As I said, this is somewhat unprecedented. We very rarely in 10 years have done this. But again, because of the quality of our guests and the information they can provide, it was necessary. We are pleased to present Jonathan Tamari, the Washington Bureau Chief of the Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as Mark Levy, the Pennsylvania Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Normally, I would discuss their bios and many awards and achievements in this segment. However, because their credentials are so impressive, we've decided to do two shows. And due to the timing constraints, their full bios will be done in part two, which will air next Sunday. At any rate, I hope you find these next two shows illuminating.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Jonathan and Mark, welcome to the Volpe Report.
Thanks for having us.
Well, as I said, in 10 years of this show, this is the first time that I've gone to the other side. My political friends would say the dark side, the media side. But this is the first time. So you've done something for our show, and being a bureau chief of the Philadelphia Inquirer in Washington and being the equivalent for all of Pennsylvania for Associated Press, Mark, you guys have the best insight. This show covers Washington and Harrisburg, essentially, as we talked about. So first question, Jonathan, will be for you. Where do I begin with the federal government in Washington? They're like, it's a panacea. It's like going to a buffet line. Let's see, what controversial issue will have the most resonance? So let's start with the first obvious one. We have an issue in this country with presidents apparently taking classified documents. I'm assuming without any permission, they took them. Trump tried to say, well, as president, I declassified them, which is interesting. That's almost the equivalent of Richard Nixon famously, I think he told David Frost, well, if the president doesn't, it's not illegal. I think you guys remember that. Well, we know what Trump is. But at any rate, first question, your comments, Jonathan. We now have the president did the right thing. Joe Biden, President Biden, and his attorney general, Merrick Garland, appointed a special counsel. Effectively, we have now a government, potentially criminal investigation of both presidents going on at the same time. Take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary circumstance. I mean, it was extraordinary when it began with the raid that we all saw and heard about on Mar-a-Lago, on President Trump's residence, to recover classified documents that apparently had been there for a long time and that he had been subpoenaed for and had refused to turn over. And in fact, his attorneys had said that they had complied with the subpoena, which turned out not to be the case.
And we know President. And we know President. There's a shocker. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Couldn't resist.
And we know President Biden was very critical of President Trump over all that, which only made it more kind of concerning or a bigger issue when it turned out that he had some classified documents in his files here in Washington, D.C. And so what's happened with Biden is that it's gone from being, well, maybe there were just a few documents to there's been a little more and a little more that's come out. And so as you point out, now we have special counsels investigating both presidents, raising questions about how common this is that these presidents are hanging on to classified documents, or if this is unique to these individuals. How serious are each of these classified documents? We don't know exactly what's in them. I think a lot of Democrats would point out that, look, Trump was asked repeatedly to return these documents and receive a subpoena and refused to do it. Biden seems to be unaware that he even had them. And as soon as they found out they had them, they did turn them back over. One of the questions, though, is that it sounds like the first batch of documents was found in November, shortly before the election. And we only heard about it here in January. That has raised questions about why didn't they disclose this fact sooner than later, even if they did do what was expected of them and return them right away. And that's a question that I think the special counsel will probably get into and look at. And notably, Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel who was a U.S. attorney under Donald Trump. So he's somebody who Trump had appointed, who is now investigating President Biden.
Right. As a follow-up, Jonathan, one of the recent stories in the New York Times that I'm aware of and I read, one of the issues, I think, is that apparently the White House had the information on the classified documents for some time before they actually publicly disclosed it. The press always knows first, and they were non-responsive almost. And then by time, I mean probably 4 or 5 days before the press secretary said, yep, we got classified documents. So, I mean, as a former trial lawyer myself and having done criminal work back in the day when I was that, that kind of suggests possible impropriety because they spent time figuring out how they were going to spin their way out of. It's clearly to me an embarrassment in a sense that they've been pretty harsh and properly so dealing with former President Trump. You just eloquently outlined some of his issues, even like lying about having turned them over when he did it. And as I said, there's a shocker. But you can be critical. I'll use an analogy. I'm a golfer. I don't know if you two golf. But I learned a valuable lesson about busting somebody's drive that gets snap hooked sideways before you tee off yourself. Usually you'll be critical when you're safely, because obviously you may return the favor. Well, Biden's administration effectively took the spotlight, and that's hard to do, off Trump, because now, and as members of the press, and I'm sure Mark may have a comment on this, once you know somebody knew, I remember famously in the Nixon case, they wanted to know what he knew and when he knew it. The when part was significant. So your comment on that. They apparently knew this before they disclosed it.
Well, I would just, not having done any reporting on this case, but to your point, there's an old adage that says that the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And so, the whole bit about, what did you know and when did you know it can turn up very damning information if it comes out, if there is something there. I don't know what the case is in this situation, but that's absolutely right, that the discovery that somebody knew something that they should have publicly reported but didn't often looks very bad to the public, whereas the public may be forgiving for some sort of transgression. The cover-up the public has shown repeatedly, in polls and in elections, that they may be less forgiving about that.
Right. And Jonathan, back to you on that issue. I mean, my own personal opinion, I'm not a political consultant, obviously, but I've learned some at the hand of masters. In my first thought, in fact, the best political consultant that ever lived, although that was not his title, to me was President John F. Kennedy. His handling of the Bay of Pigs, a disaster. He ends up getting a 20-point boost in the polls after that catastrophe because he was transparent, right up, here's what happened, I'm the responsible officer. He uttered that famous line, victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. Well, again, back to you, Jonathan. Didn't it dawn on the Biden people, okay, this is kind of a red-faced moment for us. We've been very critical of Trump, and now all of a sudden, as I said, the guy criticizing the shot, and then before he hits is a problem. Your thoughts, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I think that's probably why there was a delay in disclosing the information. They probably knew that there was a problem, even if, again, they say that the circumstances are different, the way the presidents reacted once they knew they had the classified documents are different. There's still a problem with criticizing one president over his behavior and then doing something that, at least on the surface, has a number of similarities to it. And, as Mark was talking about, the cover-up is an issue. Hypocrisy is also something that the public just really looks down on and really reacts badly to. And so if there's a sense that the current president is being hypocritical, that could be really damaging to him. And so I think that's why they'd almost probably be glad to have a special counsel involved here so that both sides can be investigated, and it could kind of be out of his administration's hand and in the special counsel's hands to kind of determine what exactly happened. But yeah, they've had to, make multiple statements now because they kept coming up with new documents that they found in different places, didn't turn out to just be one location. And so that's kind of kept this story alive and given ammunition to Republicans who want to say that either President Trump didn't do anything that bad or that President Biden did something similar.
Very good answer, Jonathan. Back to you, Mark. We'll probably take a break partway through your answer, but we have 3 or 4 minutes anyway. So, and this subject, before we turn to other issues in Pennsylvania, we swore in our 48th governor yesterday, Josh Shapiro, one of the younger governors in Pennsylvania history. And so you're first, your just general thoughts before we get into some specifics on, and by specifics, I mean this. For example, I read a great editorial, I believe it was the Philadelphia Inquirer. Max Booth is Philadelphia, right, Jonathan?
Max Booth?
Is he Philadelphia Washington Post?
He's syndicated.
Syndicated,
Yes.
okay. But at any rate, the gist of it was, and I'll give you a quote, the issue being how far to the right Josh Shapiro has gone. And of course, that only puts him in the middle. I'm not suggesting he's gone that far right, but far enough right. And I think the quote in that newspaper article was, "There's blood on the sidewalks of Pennsylvania, of progressives biting their lip, causing the blood because of how conciliatory Josh has been to the Republicans, issues that are hard-boiled for progressives. He's clearly taken and distanced himself from that." So that'll be one of the things. But your general impression of this, obviously we swore in a new governor. So general comment on that.
Well, look, I mean, Josh Shapiro had a huge win in November. He is the first governor of Pennsylvania to succeed a member of his own party since 1966. He smashed campaign finance records in this state. He has set a very high bar for himself. He has talked repeatedly about bipartisanship, about framing his victory in November, a 15-point victory, as having drawn support from the middle of the political spectrum, Republicans, independents, as well as Democrats who are very passionate about protecting abortion rights and protecting what they see as an attack on democracy, of protecting democracy from an authoritarian-styled attack. So he's set the bar high for himself. He has talked heavily about bipartisanship. He has seated his cabinet with Republicans. He has moved to the middle, as you just mentioned. He's moved to the middle on some issues. But if we're talking about progressivism, he has drawn the line and said that he will protect abortion rights. He has talked about wanting a $15 minimum wage, and he has talked about an expansion of liberalism of election laws so that we get to election day registration. That is a hallmark of liberal states, of being more open in terms of voter registration, bending over backward to make sure people can register. So he has talked the talk on some of the most passionate progressive talking points. But as you mentioned on energy, he has essentially inherited the legacy of Tom Wolfe, in that he is willing to work with the natural gas industry and the labor unions who maintain the power plants and build the pipelines and maintain and build the refineries to ensure that the natural gas industry is prosperous, and that may rub some progressives the wrong way.
Right. Well, and I applaud him for this. You know, Pennsylvania is the second biggest energy producer, according to, Eugene Barr, who was on the show when he was on it, former president of the Pennsylvania Chamber. And with the cost of fuel that Pennsylvanians are suffering with, it's the right political move, I believe, as governor for everybody. The jobs, the impact to our economy, and the ability to kind of keep prices down, you know, those are natural assets we have in Pennsylvania, you know, versus a lot of other states. So to tap into that, if you're going to govern for everybody, and I applaud him for that, by the way. Jonathan, you know him, obviously, for many years. So he's a product of Philadelphia, effectively, and the surrounding area, the bedroom counties. Your thoughts on what Mark said?
Yeah, I mean, I would make 2 points about Shapiro. First off, building off what Mark said about the size and scope of his election victory last year, that's the kind of thing that gets attention, not just in Pennsylvania. That's the kind of victory that's going to win national attention, especially when you consider how important Pennsylvania is politically in presidential races, in control of the Senate, in control of the House. It's arguably the most important swing state in the country, if you think that Florida is increasingly red, as many people do. And Shapiro is now the political leader in this state, and he's coming off a resounding victory. And we know Democrats, whether or not Joe Biden runs for another term, are looking for their next generation of leaders of who's going to come next after Biden and Pelosi and Schumer. And Shapiro is going to be a name that I think people are going to consider nationally if he is able to have success as governor, if he can actually deliver on those bipartisan promises that he's making. And that's the second part of where I think, you have to keep watching him, is that if he is able to govern well with a split legislature in a state that's very divided, that'll only build those national credentials even more. And I think it was notable when he spoke yesterday to talk about some of the bipartisan issues, some of the ways he's kind of strayed a little bit from the left, broken from the left on some issues. Public safety and police was a major theme of his during his speech yesterday. He's the former lead prosecutor in the state. And I think that is something to watch as he tries to kind of mold a profile that can appeal to the left on issues like abortion and elections, but also kind of have wider appeal in a purple state like Pennsylvania. And I think he's, again, a person to watch as a potential national figure and possibly future presidential candidate, even though it's clearly only the early days, only the second day now of his administration as we speak here.
Back to you, Mark, on this kind of same subject. It's not even a secret at this point that I've read editorials across the country already about a potential future presidential run for Josh Shapiro. And I think he's, looking to history, and he's very smart politically, especially political history. He looks back to when this country had 12 straight years of the Reagan Revolution, conservative government, Republicans winning everything for a long time. That produced, from those ashes for Democrats, rose Bill Clinton, a Southern, moderate governor, and having to appeal to a independent or moderate Republican voter that thought the party had gone too far right. So he's already cast himself, I believe, with the view not only to govern in Pennsylvania, but to look for national. And one other thing, and then I'd like you to comment on it, Mark. Having been a politician my whole life, loving it, and being a political historian myself and following it, if there were a grand design in the heavens for a person to ascend to eventually President of the United States, he is on script, almost eerily, from state legislator to a higher audience to Montgomery County commissioner. I believe when he elected, it was the first time in 75 years there was a Democratic majority in Montgomery County. Now he's got executive experience. He's checked that box. And then, of course, he ascends to Attorney General. So now you've got the criminal, tough on crime ability, because now he can say he was a prosecutor. And now he's the governor of Pennsylvania. Anybody that would doubt he has the ability to do the next step, which there's only one higher office than that, which is president. But I like your comment on, almost like too good to be true career. Your comment, Mark.
Well, look, any successful politician benefits from fortune. The tea leaves, the political winds, the fortunes of other candidates around you, would-be candidates, have to line up correctly. So Josh came of age when Montgomery was flipping from red to blue, and there was much more opportunity for him to get elected county commissioner. He has talked for years about wanting to be governor. That is the impression of people around him, that this has been his goal for years, going back to 2010 when he was in the state legislature and talked a little bit about running for U.S. Senate. That was the year Arlen Specter flipped from Republican to Democrat, and Democrats were looking for an alternative. He didn't run for U.S. Senate. He was only a state legislator at the time, but his long-term goal has been being governor. And, to be the first governor to succeed a member of your own political party since 1966, the political winds lined up very well for him. He had the experience, he had the track record as Attorney General of winning statewide twice. He's a powerhouse fundraiser. He cleared the primary field. He He lined up all the party's most important allies behind his candidacy. And when the time came, Republicans picked about the weakest candidate they probably could have picked in that primary. It's quite likely that Josh Shapiro would have beaten any Republican nominee. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that he's ever talked about president, I've never heard that. His long-term goal has been being governor. But John's right that when you are electable in perhaps the premier presidential battleground state in the United States of America, then people are going to talk about you. But I'd like to point out that the best day of any governor's life is usually inauguration day. And that was yesterday. And now, Josh Shapiro is going to have to get used to getting beaten up by Republicans, having reporters question him and question his policies and how far-reaching they are. And he's got to get things through the legislature. And it's not easy. As Attorney General, he went to the legislature seeking certain policy wants for his office and for law enforcement. And he was successful sometimes, and other times he was unsuccessful. And it can be unpredictable working with the legislature. Everything that passes, every new law is going to have a Republican stamp of approval because there's a 6-seat Republican majority in the Senate. And in Pennsylvania, it's a very politically divided state. We all know that. And it's a lot of people would tell you that moderate politics are good politics. Those are winning politics. There's a reason why, a Democrat hasn't won statewide by saying that he wants to or she wants to ban fracking. When the time comes, when the Democrat has to win statewide, they will moderate some of those things. There are certain things that Democrats have not necessarily moderated, that they've gone more to the left along with their party, say perhaps on abortion or guns, but yeah, I mean, it may be that moderate politics is going to be what helps Josh Shapiro as governor and helps him be successful. If he's not successful, then nobody's talking about him, in 4 years, if he's fortunate enough to win re-election and there's a presidential election around the corner.
Right. Well, and as you point out, the tea leaves have lined up for him. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the future, about his tenure as governor. In my lifetime, I'm not sure I can ever remember more acrimony and more polarization between the General Assembly and Tom Wolf's administration for 8 years. He was the first governor in history not to sign a budget for the first term. It all went in by operation of law, as you guys both know. And so the bar's kind of low. If he gets some bipartisanship, which he clearly will do, it's already going to be a success over what happened during the Wolf administration. And then, of course, he benefited by having a Republican extremist candidate. I did have an opinion piece that I described him as right of Attila the Hun, was Senator Doug Mastriano. So that helped too. It helped so much that not only did he raise a record sum of money, he spent a lot of money down ballot, which helped him. He had coattails in congressional races with the Lisa Scheller race versus Susan Wild, Jonathan, like the Jim Bognett race against Matt Cartwright. They're guests of this show regularly, by the way. So at any rate, so he had that. He was actually running commercials somewhat covertly in the primary promoting Mastriano. So that's a record first for me in my lifetime as well. So let me turn now back to you, Jonathan. Some of your comment on that, because he may be heading your way at some point down to Washington. So your thought on that. And obviously you've seen him through his whole career. You're from the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is his hometown newspaper. Take it.
Yeah, we've seen, and I think, as Mark points out, Josh Shapiro has relentlessly said he's focused on governor. He's not out there talking about running for president the day that he becomes governor. I think that this is more something that people who have watched him have seen him relentlessly take step by step by step. And now he's governor at the age of 49. I think a lot of people think that someone like him will at least want to have an eye on higher office. But as Mark points out, he's got to govern first. He's got to be a good governor. He's got to avoid scandals. He's got to, there could be a recession next year, a national recession, a global recession. That's not really in the governor's hands, but he might as the governor, he's going to have to navigate that if that happens. He's going to have to try to get some deals done with Harrisburg. So that's the challenge, but it's also the opportunity, because if you can run, again, theoretically, if he ever does run for president, you're able to come and say, listen, Washington is broken. There's all this gridlock. I worked across the aisle in a purple state with a legislature from the other party. That's something that I think a lot of voters are receptive to. And I think something that governors have an advantage of over people who might come out of an administration or come out of Congress, who are kind of seen as part of Washington and the problem in Washington that so many people love to hate. So there's opportunities, there's perils for him. He has been a skillful politician to this point in his career. He knows Harrisburg very well from his days in the state legislature and as attorney general. So there's a feeling that he might be able to navigate some of these things more deftly than other governors have. And so again, there's a lot of opportunity along with the risk that he has as he becomes governor here.
Well stated. We are going to go to a break now, guys, so stay with us, obviously, and we'll be just a moment or two. So it's been wonderful, this back and forth, and I look forward to continuing other large issues with you when we come back.
Every week, Chuck Volpe shares his perspective on Pennsylvania issues in the news and on your mind. From new laws being introduced in Harrisburg and Washington to government spending and even local controversies, hear how they affect us in Northeast and Central Pennsylvania. Catch Volpe's views every Tuesday on the Fox 56 News, first at 10.
Well, guys, it's been a rare thing. It's only happened once or twice in 10 years that the repartee back and forth between us and the in-depth answers you've provided, which have been wonderful, by the way, has sucked all the air out of a 30-minute show. As I said, couldn't even really do our normal break. And it's so much so that I'm going to do something somewhat unprecedented, and you have kindly agreed to humor me, of sticking around for another half-hour show, because the substantive issues that are going to take more than 3 or 4 minutes that we need to get into, while I have you captured in your mind for this moment in time, I'd love to be able to get into some of that. So thank you for indulging me, and we are going to break now because this will be this Sunday show, but we're going to come right back on, which will effectively be another half-hour part 2 with you guys. So thank you for your participation, and thank you for sticking around for part 2.
See you next week.